Red Foxx, the legendary comedian and star of Sanford and Son, owned a modest ranch-style home in Las Vegas where he lived during the later years of his life. After his passing in 1991, the house changed hands several times, but in local circles it has long carried a reputation for being haunted. In recent years, a young couple named Martin and Elise, originally from California, purchased the property. They were drawn in by its history, the affordability compared to Los Angeles real estate, and the idea of living in a home once owned by a comedy legend. At first, they treated the haunted house stories as little more than local folklore meant to amuse tourists. But once they moved in, strange experiences began to pile up. It started small. Doors closing by themselves, the faint smell of cigar smoke drifting through the living room even though neither of them smoked, and lights flickering despite an updated electrical system. The couple tried to dismiss these events, but soon they began to hear laughter, a raspy, unmistakable chuckle that seemed to come from nowhere. Elise claimed she once heard a voice muttering angrily when she misplaced her keys, as though someone else in the room had grown impatient. Martin noticed that his tools in the garage were constantly moved or scattered about, though he was meticulous about organization. Even more unsettling was the sound of heavy footsteps pacing in the hallway at night, stopping outside their bedroom door. When he opened it, no one was there. Locals had long said Red Fox's spirit never truly left the house. Known for his fiery temper, quick wit, and stubborn streak, Foxx reportedly collapsed from a heart attack in that very home while rehearsing for a TV comeback. Some believe the suddenness of his passing left his energy restless. The couple eventually brought in a friend who was sensitive to the paranormal. Without being told much about the history, she immediately remarked on the loud man, whose presence lingered in the house, describing his sharp voice and tendency to storm out of rooms in anger. This lined up eerily with Foxx's well-documented personality. Instead of fleeing, Martin and Elise decided to coexist with the spirit. They often talk aloud when they feel his presence, addressing him with respect. Sometimes they'll even play old records of Red Fox's comedy routines in the living room, and strangely enough, the activity in the house seems to calm after these sessions, almost as if the spirit is soothed by hearing his own voice again. The house today remains occupied by the couple, though they've admitted that they never feel completely alone. Visitors have claimed to feel a sudden chill when passing through the hallway or to hear muffled laughter from empty rooms. For Martin and Elise, the house is not just their home, it's a strange, uneasy coexistence with the lingering energy of one of comedy's greatest legends. The desert nights around Las Vegas carry a strange silence, one that seems to press against the walls of houses on the edge of the city. For Martin and Elise, that silence became an inseparable part of their life after moving into Red Fox's old home. By day, the house felt almost ordinary, with its low-slung design, sun-faded stucco, and wide front yard edged by gravel instead of grass. The desert sun bathed the property in gold, softening its edges, and making the neighborhood appear as calm and untroubled as any other. But once night fell, the air inside thickened, as though time slowed and the house itself leaned closer to listen. At first, Elise tried to dismiss the oddities as her imagination. The flickering lights could be faulty wiring, the smell of smoke could have drifted from a neighbor's yard, and the laughter, well, she told herself it might have been the television from the house across the street. But there was a weight to it, a personal quality, as if the sound carried intention. It wasn't random, nor was it distant. The chuckle always seemed to hover close, just over her shoulder, fading before she could fully turn her head. Martin took longer to admit what he was experiencing. He was pragmatic, the kind of man who trusted routine and simple explanations. But even he could not ignore the objects that moved on their own. In the garage, he would place a wrench carefully into its spot on the pegboard, only to return the next day to find it lying flat on the workbench, or worse, on the floor as though tossed down in irritation. One night, while repairing a shelf, he heard footsteps pacing heavily behind him, crossing the concrete with a deliberate rhythm. He spun around, expecting Elise, but the space was empty. Still, the sound had been too real, too present to be a trick of the mind. He left the garage lights on for the rest of the night. As weeks turned into months, the couple grew attuned to the subtler signs. Doors didn't just close, they slammed with a force that rattled the frames, though the air in the house remained still. Drawers opened just enough to catch one's eye, as if daring someone to notice. More unnerving was the hallway outside their bedroom. At night, they both heard the dragging of feet, slow and deliberate, stopping just short of the door. The carpet absorbed most sounds, yet these footsteps carried weight, pressing into their ears like echoes on tile. Neither of them dared to open the door at first, preferring to listen in frozen silence, their breaths shallow and their hearts thudding. One evening, Elise stood in the living room gazing at the old photographs she had hung on the wall to make the space feel more like home. The faint smell of smoke drifted in again, stronger than before. She waved her hand, thinking it was nothing, but the odor clung to her clothes and hair. Almost at the same time, she heard that laugh, deep and coarse, rolling out from the corner of the room. It wasn't cruel nor joyful, but something in between, like a man laughing at his own private thought. She whispered, "Red?" without realizing she had spoken aloud. The room fell silent instantly, as though her recognition had unsettled the very air. Later, when she told Martin, he tried to reassure her, but his face betrayed his own unease. He confessed then that he had been hearing muttering in the garage, low voices that didn't belong to either of them. Sometimes it was just a single word he couldn't catch, other times a string of syllables that blurred together, too quick and angry to decipher. They began to realize that the house wasn't simply replaying echoes of the past. Something intelligent lingered here, aware of them, watching, maybe even interacting. Despite the tension, they decided not to leave. There was an odd sense of attachment forming between them and the house, as if they were unwilling participants in a story they couldn't abandon. Elise started leaving out a small glass of whiskey on the coffee table, half as a joke and half as an offering. To her surprise, on the nights she did this, the atmosphere softened. The footsteps in the hallway quieted, and the laughter became less sharp, almost approving. Martin, though skeptical, noticed it too. Their friends, when invited over, often remarked on the odd feeling in the house. One couple refused to stay past midnight, claiming the air grew too heavy after dark. Another friend swore she felt someone brush past her shoulder in the kitchen while Elise was cooking. It was as though the house was not content to reveal itself only to its owners. It wanted its presence acknowledged by all who entered. And yet, for Martin and Elise, the true dread came not from the laughter, or the smoke, or the footsteps. It came in the rare moments when the house seemed to fall completely silent. Not a creak, not a sound, only a stillness that pressed so hard against them that they could hear the blood rushing in their ears. It was in that silence that they felt most watched, as if someone stood inches away, invisible, waiting for them to acknowledge it. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. The desert wind had a way of whistling through the cracks of the old stucco walls, carrying with it a mournful tone that sometimes made the entire house feel alive. Martin and Elise began to notice how the house responded to their moods. On evenings when they argued, the lights flickered more violently, almost angrily. When they were calm, sipping wine together in the living room, the energy felt different, still heavy, but less intrusive, as though the unseen presence was listening rather than disrupting. They stopped joking about the hauntings. The house had become too unpredictable to laugh off. The living room, with its sunken floor and wood-paneled walls, seemed to hold the most activity. It was the same room where Red Fox himself had spent long nights playing cards, entertaining friends, or pacing while rehearsing lines. Elise would sit on the couch late into the night, trying to read, but her eyes always lifted to the corners of the room where the shadows pooled deeper than they should have. Sometimes she swore the shape of a man stood there, shoulders broad, head tilted slightly as though watching her with impatience. She never saw a face, only the outline, darker than the darkness itself. One night, as Martin prepared to go to bed, he heard the unmistakable sound of change spilling across the kitchen counter. Coins rattled, clinked, and rolled onto the floor. He hurried in, expecting Elise, but the room was empty. The only thing out of place was a single quarter balanced perfectly on its edge at the center of the table. He froze, the hair on his arms rising. When he reached out to touch it, the coin toppled flat with a sharp ring that echoed louder than it should have in the stillness of the house. He didn't mention it to Elise until days later, and when he finally did, she admitted she had been hearing faint voices in the kitchen during the afternoon's muttering, like a one-sided conversation cut off when she entered the room. Their nights became restless. The hallway outside their bedroom turned into a corridor of dread. The footsteps returned again and again, some dragging, some brisk and heavy, always stopping in the same place just outside their door. Once, Martin swore he heard knuckles rap softly against the wood. A deliberate knock, followed by silence so thick it felt like the air had been sucked from the room. They slept with the lamp on after that, the soft glow casting weak shadows that only made the space seem smaller, more confined. Despite their growing fear, neither of them could deny the fascination that kept them tied to the house. When Elise played recordings of Red Fox's comedy routines, the house seemed to relax. The laughter that had once unnerved her shifted in tone, as if echoing the same cadence from the tapes. Once, after a joke ended on a sharp punchline, a burst of laughter erupted in the room, louder, fuller, layered over the recording itself. Elise dropped the remote in shock, but Martin only whispered, "He's here." The strangest moment came during a quiet Sunday morning. Elise was alone in the backyard, watering the few desert plants that struggled against the heat. The yard was still, the gravel crunching softly beneath her feet. Then she heard it clear as day, someone whistling a tune she didn't recognize. It wasn't coming from the street or a neighbor's yard. It floated directly from the patio door behind her, though she knew Martin was out running errands. When she turned, the blinds in the living room swayed slightly, as if someone had brushed past them. She dropped the hose, water spraying in a crooked arc, and didn't go back inside until Martin returned. Over time, their friends stopped visiting. Word spread quickly in Las Vegas about the Foxx house, and even those who laughed at ghost stories felt unsettled inside its walls. One friend refused to sit on the couch, insisting she felt a hand press against her shoulder when she tried. Another walked out mid-conversation, pale and trembling, claiming she heard someone whispering her name in the hallway. Martin and Elise were left alone with the house, their circle shrinking until only they remained to endure its moods. It wasn't just about noises or shadows anymore. The house began to impress itself into their lives in subtle, intimate ways. They misplaced objects constantly: keys, wallets, jewelry, only for them to reappear in odd places, like lined up neatly on the coffee table or resting on the arm of the couch. The radio in the bedroom turned on by itself, always to stations playing old blues or jazz, music that neither of them had programmed. Even their dreams seemed infected, filled with images of a man's silhouette standing in doorways, or the echo of gravel crunching under unseen footsteps. And though they tried to live normally, an unease began to seep into their daily rhythm. Elise noticed she no longer felt truly alone in any room. Martin, once a man of logic and certainty, grew quieter, his eyes often drifting toward the shadows as though expecting them to move. At dinner, they spoke less about the future, more about what had happened that day in the house, as if their lives had narrowed down to this single strange reality. The longer they stayed, the stronger the feeling became that the house wanted something from them, some acknowledgement beyond whispered words or offerings of whiskey. It was no longer enough to simply coexist. The spirit, whoever or whatever it was, pressed closer with each passing week, waiting. The days in the desert dragged on with their blistering heat, but inside the Foxx house the air never quite matched the outside world. It always felt heavier, a fraction too cool, as though the sun could not reach all the way into its corners. Elise started to notice that the windows, no matter how clean, seemed to let in less light than they should have, leaving the living room dim even at noon. Dust gathered quickly in the hall despite her efforts to sweep it away, settling in the grooves of the carpet like the house was trying to age itself faster than she could keep up. Martin worked late more often now, not because his job demanded it, but because he found excuses to linger in town, at coffee shops or hardware stores, anywhere that wasn't home. When he returned after dark, he felt the shift the moment he stepped inside. The stale air, the faint trace of smoke, and the uneasy awareness of being observed. He never admitted it outright, but Elise could see it on him. He hesitated before entering rooms, his footsteps slower, his voice softer, as though trying not to provoke something that was always just beyond reach. At night, their sleep grew shallow and broken. Elise began waking at 3 a.m., a time that seemed etched into the walls themselves. The house was never louder than in those early hours. Pipes groaning as if under pressure, floorboards creaking with weight, a cough deep and rough echoing from the living room when no one was there. More than once, she shook Martin awake, but by the time he stumbled into the hall the noises had ceased, leaving only silence that made them both uneasy. One night she woke to find the bedroom lamp already on, glowing faintly. Martin swore he hadn't touched it, and the switch was firm in the off position when he checked. They left it alone, the bulb humming with a weak, unnatural light until it burned itself out hours later. Elise didn't replace it. She couldn't bring herself to. The garage became another source of dread. Martin had once treated it as his refuge, a place where he could tinker and distract himself. But the more time he spent there, the stronger the sense of intrusion became. Tools clattered without cause, metal against cement, sharp and sudden. Once, he felt the hot rush of air at his neck, unmistakably like someone leaning in close enough to exhale against his skin. He bolted from the garage that night, leaving the lights on, the workbench cluttered, the door hanging open to the desert night. Elise, meanwhile, found herself avoiding mirrors. The bathroom mirror in particular began to trouble her. She swore that when she passed it quickly, she saw a figure lingering over her shoulder, too tall and too sharply defined to be a trick of light. Once she stopped in front of it, gathering her nerve to look directly, but nothing was there, just her pale reflection, her tired eyes. Still, she draped a towel over it the next day, and Martin didn't question why. The laughter had changed, too. It was no longer a casual chuckle drifting into the room. It had grown sharper, fuller, and it seemed to follow them from one part of the house to another, rolling from the corners, bouncing off the walls. Sometimes Elise thought it carried words beneath it, hidden in the rhythm of the sound, something mocking but indistinct. Martin claimed he heard his name spoken once, buried in that rasping voice. He didn't tell Elise immediately, not wanting to frighten her, but the truth slipped out days later during dinner, when the clink of a fork against the plate was interrupted by a sudden low mutter from the hallway. They both froze, staring at each other, realizing they had both heard it. The house seemed to know when they acknowledged it. After that night, the activity escalated. Photographs slid from the walls in the middle of the day, glass shattering across the floor. Cupboard doors swung wide and banged shut when Elise tried to cook. Even their cat, a usually calm tabby, began to hiss at empty spaces, her fur standing on end before bolting to hide under the bed. They tried to ground themselves in routine, but the house pressed against their lives, reshaping their every moment. Yet despite the fear, they didn't leave. Something rooted them there, as though the house had woven invisible threads around their lives, tightening with each passing week. When friends asked if they had thought about moving, they brushed it off, saying the market wasn't right, or they were too busy. But privately, both of them felt the truth. The thought of leaving was as suffocating as the thought of staying. The house had claimed them, and in the silence before dawn, when the last echoes of laughter died away, they sometimes heard the faintest sound of breathing not their own, not each other's, deep, steady, and patient, coming from the far side of the room, as though someone had been sitting there all along waiting. In the end, the house never gave them peace. Martin and Elise lasted less than a year before packing their belongings and leaving most of their furniture behind. They never spoke publicly about everything they had experienced, but neighbors noticed how pale and withdrawn they looked in those final weeks, how Elise refused to step onto the porch after sunset, and how Martin always kept the garage door locked. After they left, the property sat vacant for months. Realtors avoided it, and buyers who toured the home rarely returned for a second visit. Those who did described the same things: an unnatural heaviness in the air, the faint smell of cigar smoke, and the echo of laughter from rooms they hadn't yet entered. The Foxx house still stands on the quiet Las Vegas street, its walls holding the weight of one man's sudden death and fiery spirit. For those who know its history, The house is more than just another piece of desert real estate. It's a place where time doesn't move forward, where the voice of Red Fox still lingers, restless, making sure no one forgets he once called it home. Would you spend a night here? Comment below. Which house should I do next?